Hello everyone. My name is Parul and I'm part of the FactSpan analytics team. We are into the big data and decision science space. Well, FactSpan is the leading pure play analytics professional services company with heavy emphasis on cloud data engineering, data and strategic analytics, and machine learning with latest tools and technologies. We've initiated this entire webinar, Cut the Clutter sessions, with the single objective of designing a forum to educate people on the different trending and upcoming topics in the data AI ML space. Our episode one, which is now, is on data governance, wherein our speakers Charles Smart, head of data governance at FactSpan, and Hitin Sushruth, who will walk us through their experiences of assisting several Fortune 100 companies and essentially covering how a strong foundation of data governance would help develop a strong data culture within the organization. Now, let me take a moment and introduce our speakers for today. Charles Smart, hi Charles, has overall 20 plus years of experience as an information management consultant, leading and managing the implementation of enterprise data initiatives. Whereas Hitin has a master's degree in business analytics and data science, and he has a lot of experience in setting up necessary processes, checks for migrating data between databases, working towards data governance maturity, etc. So, okay, it seems exciting to be here. And before I hand over to you, Charles, let me just put down certain housekeeping pointers over here. So, yes, the first thing is while Charles and Hitin they talk about their data governance experiences, please feel free to share your questions, your thoughts, comments on the chat box that you see at the right hand side of your screen. Towards the end, we will pick those questions, and obviously, depending upon the time that we are left with, we'll be prioritizing some of them, and Charles and Hitin would take them up one by one. Also, once the webinar gets over, you'll be receiving the recording of this entire session to your registered email. Also, if at all there are some queries which kind of go unanswered, please send those queries to us at marketing@factspan.com. So, okay, here I hand over to Charles.
Thank you so much, Pearl, for that introduction and welcome everybody. I hope everyone is having a fantastic Wednesday. Well, I look forward to sharing some valuable information with you, and hopefully the takeaways that you have here will allow you to start your data governance journey if you haven't already started it. And if you have already started it, hopefully we'll give you some insights into some of the ways to accelerate that or improve on the things that you're doing already. So we're here to talk about data governance. And so I think it's important for those who may not know what data governance is to talk about what is it? What is it? We think about data governance and we think about four key pillars. There's data, people, process, and policies. And those things come together to basically enable your organization to manage its data in a responsible way. And so data shows up in many different forms today. It's not just data in a databases, but you have images and videos and so many other forms of data, biometric information, and we have, of course, the people that interact with that data on a day-to-day basis and use the data to make decisions or process the information that you need. And of course, you have your processes in place that allow you to move that data through, or processes that allow you to run your business. But all of those things are going to be driven by policies, whether they're written explicitly and formalized within your organization, or they are informal about how you do it, when you do it, under what circumstances, and what methods. And so, for the most part, most organizations are already in some way doing data governance. They may just not have identified and defined it as such. Now, why is data governance important? So, there are many different things that we could think about here, but we're going to talk about some of the key areas. Effective data management. Ultimately, in your organization, you use a lot of data, and you need to be able to understand where that data is before you can even think about managing it. And so, effective data management is one of the key areas that organizations usually start with in order to get them to understand, okay, where do I need to go and what do I need to do with my data? Improve decision making, improve data quality. Data quality is a big issue for many organizations as well, because bad data in equals bad decisions. And of course, the compliance landscape is changing with the new regulations that are coming out every year that are basically forcing organizations now to implement new standards and policies around how they use their data. And of course, data security. No organization wants to be on the front page or on the major news channel talking about a data breach that they've experienced. So these are just some of the areas and some of the reasons why data governance is important. And we're going to delve a little bit more into the principles of data governance so you understand that when you talk about these things, these are the things that we talk about when we're speaking about data governance from a principles perspective. So there's management of your data, right? You need to understand who's managing the data. You need to know who the managers are, first of all, and basically have some process around how the data is being managed within your organization. In addition to that, to be able to hold those individuals accountable, right? So if something does happen, you have a process and you're able to identify who was responsible for whatever happened with the data. And that requires you to have formalized standards. And for those people or stewards, are those people within your organization that most times already exist, but are informally stewarding your data, right? They're the individuals that know the reports and the meaning of the fields that are on your reports and the data and how it's organized within your organization. And of course, inventory of your data. Understanding data is spread in all over the place in your organization in many different environments. And it's important to be able to have an inventory of what you have so that you can manage it. And security, we talked about earlier, privacy, data quality, defining your data properly. So many times we have a report that you may have in your organization that has three, the field is named the same thing on each of the reports, and you end up having to figure out what does that particular, definition, what's the true definition of that particular field. And so data governance helps you to accomplish that. And of course, policies and processes. So when you think about data governance from a principles perspective, these are the core principles, and you're going to see those principles showing up multiple times as we go through the rest of the presentation today. Now, the thing about data governance for many organizations that it seems very daunting, right? It seems like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get started? Where do we get started? And I'm sharing this slide with you so that you can see what a mature data governance framework looks like. And so data governance for many organizations, they may think about it as a tool that they may have implemented, or they may think about a particular process or a project that they may have within the organization that focuses on data governance. And what I want to emphasize here is that data governance is a part of your organization's culture. And in addition to being a part of the organization's culture, that framework has many different functions that will allow you to do that. And I wanted to focus right now on the pie in the middle that shows the 5 areas that we think about when we think about a data governance framework. There's the discovery and the assessment component. And this is where you discover your organization's data, where your data is, who is using the data, how is it classified, how are the processes, what are the processes and the flows that move your data through the organization. And having a good understanding of that will allow you to be able to do the other components that you have there. Then you have data subject rights, which we're going to talk about in depth because it's very new for many organizations. Data security, data governance, and stewardship, and data architecture. Now, these are the 5 pillars, and we're going to dig into each of these individual boxes that you see here. But I don't want you to get overwhelmed and think, oh my God, where do we start? How are we going to get all of these things done? This is a journey. I was sharing earlier about climbing a mountain and how to get to the top of the mountain, you may not start with the first step. And so it's a process and iterative. And we're going to go through each of these pieces right now to show you how you can start to build your data governance framework into maturity. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about the foundation. And at the foundation here of data governance, we have the data governance. If you click the slide one more time, we need to see the bottom component there. Thank you. So ultimately, we talk about governance and we talk about the foundation of it. And one of the things that many organizations don't realize is that in order to have an effective and successful data governance journey, it is going to be important that your organization has top level executive leadership. And the reason for that is many organizations start within a particular department, and they start within that department, and then they realize that, hey, I use data, but the data that I use is not just for me. It's basically data that's being used by many other departments. And as you start to put controls and standards around that, you find it becomes difficult to do that simply because you have to get other teams to get on board with the project. And so it's not a siloed thing. It has to be done across your enterprise. And that's where executive leadership comes into play. And it's a key role and super important for the success of that data governance journey. Many organizations get frustrated because they don't have the support of the entire organization, and basically end up with silos of data, which only exacerbates and make the situation worse. And then a strategy is necessary, and having executive leadership helps you to prioritize things, helps you to set a strategy for what you're going to prioritize in the organization, what you're going to work on, and how that's going to be done. Now, policies and standards are the things that are going to drive the how you do it, the when you do it, under what circumstances it needs to get done, as it pertains to each of these specific areas, these key 5 areas. And as such, we have to make sure that those policies are in place, because those policies, whether it's your data classification policy or your access policy or your usage policy within your organization, it's going to be important that those things are in place in order for your organization to be able to implement the other key pillars of data governance. And of course, legal and compliance, we're talking here about your team that's concerned about your organization's exposure. And data is critical today when we talk about data breaches and making sure that we're also compliant with the new privacy acts that are coming online. And so they are integral to be part of your organization's data governance journey, because they're going to help you as you may technically implement your data governance or put in place your business processes to be able to support your data governance journey. They need to have oversight into this to make sure that your organization is not going to be doing something that's going to ultimately put them at risk. And then I use education and training here, but I really want to talk about this as more of a marketing campaign. A lot of times adoption is one of the main reasons why data governance fails within an organization, because they haven't taken the time to educate the broader audience within the organization or where the project starts about what needs to be done. And adoption requires change, and a huge change management process needs to be thought through. And a big part of that is educating your organization and training them about what needs to be done, about what you're going to be doing, and what role they'll play in that journey, so that they understand when you come to them and you say, hey, we're doing this particular thing over here for a data governance project, and this is the function that we're working on. We need your help. They'll understand that they need to be an active part of that. And ongoing, it's going to be very important that you also monitor the work that you're doing, right? One of the things that people love, we love to have metrics that talk about where we were and where we are now. And so being able to audit the progress, at a very detailed level at the individual functions is going to be also critical for you to be able to get adoption and for you to be able to understand how far along you are with maturing your data governance journey. So data, people, process, and policies. I want you guys to keep that top of mind as we go through this, because those are the key pieces that are basically going to drive when we talk about data governance in all of these different slides that we're going through. And laying that foundation within your organization with executive leadership is paramount. Now we're going to go a little bit into where the work normally starts. So generally speaking, before you can start doing any of this data governance work within your organization, you need to understand where your data is. If you don't know where your data is, you can't govern it, right? And if you don't understand your data's landscape, you're not going to be able to understand the interdependencies and the impact of the changes that you may want to make within your organization, whether those changes are to system processes or to the infrastructure or to implement new technology, and understanding what that technology needs to be either monitoring or engaging with in order for you to be able to be effective at rolling this out on an enterprise level. And I keep saying enterprise. I know that for many organizations is very daunting, because they're like, how are we going to get an entire organization on board to do this? And I want to emphasize that discovery and assessment, and actually for all of the different functions of data governance that you may implement, to be conscious that you don't boil the ocean. Start with your critical data. Identify the big pain points in your organization, the points where the business or the business unit or subject area is a challenge for the organization. There are constant complaints about it. Start with that small subset of data, build value in it within a specific function, demonstrate that to the organization, and build slowly and expand the different functions that you add and expand the amount of data that you do. Eventually, you get to the top of that mountain. And then to adopt technology that's specific to your organization, right? It's really important that there are many technologies out there, and you may say, okay, this is the best one, based on whether it's Gartner or any other technology review organizations. But ultimately, you want to make sure that you understand what the criteria is for your organization. And in order to do that, you have to do the discovery and assessment. So you make sure you're going to select the correct tool that's going to fit the needs that your organization has. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit here about something that's relatively new, because it's only come out for the most part, or it's been popularized, I think, because of GDPR. And so data subject rights, right? Or data subject access rights. And data subject rights are basically consumers now have the right to request organizations to basically fulfill certain requests that they will have on the data that they collect from those customers. And so many different privacy acts, we're familiar with things like CCPA, which California Consumer Protection Act, or CPA, Colorado Protection Act, and VCPA, which is coming out next year. And there are many, many more data privacy laws that are being passed annually. Just a few years ago, we only had 2. There are currently almost 30 new privacy laws on the docket to be released within the coming years. They're at some stage of being either reviewed or in committee to be passed as new laws for the entire United States. So we're going basically from 2 to maybe 30 plus data privacy laws that organizations will have to comply with coming in the next few years. And as such, data governance is going to be extremely important, because you're going to have to be responsible to be compliant with these requests that your organization will have to fulfill. And so what are some of those requests? A consumer may be able to ask you, hey, erase all the data that you have for me, or rectify my data wherever you have it within your systems, whether it's my name is changed, my date of birth that's incorrect, or inform me of all the data that you have of me, right? You have to basically have explicit consent from the consumers to be able to use the data in particular ways. You'll need to be able to restrict that data as well. And even in automated decision making, basically you may have algorithms that you use within your organization to look at your group of consumers to market to them. And a user may say, hey, a consumer might say, hey, I don't want you to do this anymore with my data. And you need to be able to isolate that individual's data within your organization so that you don't process it. And they may even ask you, give it all back to me. Give all the data that you have in your organization on me and send it to me. And if you don't have a good understanding of where your data is and how it's being used, and it's not classified, you're not going to be able to implement those processes. And if you don't have any policies around how you're going to manage that within your organization, you will not be able to fulfill those things. And as a result, they come with penalties, because organizations who are not able to fulfill these things will be potentially fined if that particular consumer decides to seek or to pursue that. And I just want to emphasize, data governance ultimately, it doesn't fix this problem, but it definitely enables and accelerates your ability to be compliant. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about data security here. Now, data security, we all probably know about, protecting our data in our databases, and the different tools that we may use. Every organization is different. The tools that you may use may be very different in how you secure your data, whether the data is in motion or the data is at rest. But one of the things I want to say here is, Data that you don't have, you don't need to govern, right? I'll emphasize that. Data that you don't have, you don't need to govern. And so organizations a lot of times don't think about, hey, how do I reduce the risk? Or how do I reduce my exposure? Or how do I reduce the amount of places that I need to go and protect my data? And one of the key and simplest ways to do that is just, hey, get rid of the data. And this requires some strategy around data lifecycle management that your organization needs to have to be able to understand when your data comes in. You're not just thinking about how it comes in and how you're storing it and how you're using it, but you're also thinking about how you archive it and how you ultimately get rid of that data so that you're no longer having to deal with any of the compliance or other legal or even processing concerns that that data will have. Now, data protection takes on many different forms within every organization. Your organization may be on-prem. Your organization may be in the cloud. It might be hybrid. Your organization may have been operating for a very long time and use very old technology, or you may have just started a few months ago and you are very, very young. However, how you implement these data protection controls within your organization is going to be specific to your organization and what that and how that's done. But one of the things that I want to also emphasize here is that, many of times we have these IT groups and development teams that work within your organization, and your production environments may be very well protected. You have all the controls and processes for someone to get access to the data or to use the data or to monitor it. But then someone in your development team says, hey, I need to build this new thing. Can you give me some of this data out of the customer table? And so somebody takes a copy of the production customer table and they move it into their non-production environment. And all of a sudden, there are no controls in the development environment. And so you can understand the impact that that has in the way that organizations work today. Onshore, offshore resources, and individuals that may not necessarily be monitored in the way that they're using the data, which exposes the organization to potential breach, or for individuals that are accessing information within that data set that they should not be. And so it's important that we have controls that are put around that. And it's not just around the data, it's how the data in motion, so that's how the data may be moving across your network, in addition to data that you have at rest. And so it's important that there is a process around dev operations re-engineering so that organizations have a very clear process around how their development teams are working with data, so it's not putting the organization at risk. And I'm not just talking about the security side, it has multiple implications across privacy and many, many other parts of data governance functions that we're going to be talking about as we go along here. And then, if you don't know who's accessing the data, you can't protect it. So it's really important to have the processes around who's accessing it and the ability to monitor that, so that as the access is happening, you're able to identify, and technology will help you tremendously in being able to implement these different tools and processes that will allow you to identify, hey, when someone is looking at my data inappropriately at an incorrect time, or looking at data that they shouldn't be accessing, and you have a process to be able to audit and auditively go out and say, hey, these are the individuals that have access to this particular data, and this is the policy that's applied to it. This is our access and usage policy for organization that's clearly defined, and this is the process for provisioning and deprovisioning of access. So these are things that organizations have to think about data governance, because ultimately it's about being able to manage, hold those individuals accountable, and create standards and policies around it so that we can have a clear understanding of how our data security landscape looks. Now, this is where the work happens. This is where a lot of the technology comes in. All those other pieces that we just talked about were more focused on discovery, process. There's quite a bit of work that still has to be done around data protection, but really understanding your data and being able to have your data help you to do better business, to make decisions better, and understand where it is, catalog it, to create new processes, really lies within your data architecture. And we're going to talk about laying the future data foundation, right? And that starts with many organizations. This is where most organizations actually start with their data governance. It's usually with some data cataloging tool where they want to understand where their data is. And you'll realize that the tools and the different functions that we're talking about here ultimately will have many overlaps with other pieces of this pie, right? You talk about a data catalog tool, for example, that will ingest all of your data, and ultimately it will help you to discover your data. It will help you to be able to assess it. It will help you to be able to apply your policies. It will help you to be able to implement your data security rules and be able to apply that so that's visible to the organization, right? We also talk about things like data lifecycle management. I mentioned it earlier, where you need to think about when data comes in and your different teams are creating processes or creating new solutions within your organization, that they're thinking about the data in a way that they're thinking about how the data comes in and how ultimately that data is going to cycle through, right? How it's going to go through that stage of storing the data, being used, archiving it, protecting it, and ultimately getting rid of it. And that needs to be a part of the thought process. And those are processes, but ultimately those processes are driven by policies and standards that the organization has put in place. And then, of course, the big thing, right, for most organizations around data governance that they talk about all the time is data quality, right? So bad data in is bad data out, right? And so organizations have to have the different rules standardized in central place and have the tools that are able to allow that to be used across the entire enterprise, whether it's in your ETL processes that you have or within your development teams that are ingesting data through their streaming platforms, or the code team, the teams that develop your code that are basically moving the data through, that they have the same rules are being applied to everywhere you see, a telephone number. The standardization is happening the same way. In addition to that, you also want to make sure that you have visibility into what's happening beforehand. So you have profiling tools that help you to identify where these anomalies will be. So when you're creating these different data quality rules, you're creating them based on information that you have from the data that you're looking at with the technology that you may implement. And to also have some kind of observation on that data where you're getting notified if anomalies happen, right? So you're able to take action, identify where the big pain points are within your organization, and then go back and create the processes in order to implement that based on the different policies that the organization has. So, and of course, the big master data management with organizations have been trying to do is not converging a lot under what we data governance through some of the different functions that we have and need to implement. So, ultimately going forward, we talked about the five, pieces of the pie, and I hope that you have a better understanding of the different pieces of data governance in terms of the different functions that you think about, right? Because many times you may have thought of data governance as just this one thing. You may be doing data quality and you may call it data governance, or you may be doing data protection and you call it data governance. They're all just a part of a bigger maturity framework. And as your organization matures, that framework that we just went through is what brings you to that full maturity. Now, in order to be able to do this, I've emphasized executive leadership. And the reason that I keep speaking about executive leadership is because it's probably one of the number one reasons why data governance projects fail. You need that executive sponsor because you need to create a culture within your organization. And if you don't create a culture within your organization, then you're going to be doing an uphill fight, right? If you're at the bottom of this pyramid and you're trying to get stuff done, it's going to be very challenging. But you need your executive leadership to be able to say that this is a part of our organization's journey, and this is something that we're going to be focused on. And it's important for everyone in the organization to take data governance seriously. The next thing is you need to basically have a body. The executives are not going to be there running the day-to-day, but you do need someone to be able to go to resolve challenges or conflicts. And trust me, you're going to have many challenges and conflicts about who owns the data, about how the data should be organized, about different policies that you need to put in place and how those policies should be implemented. And you need a body that's basically consistent of a cross-section of different departments within your organization, whether it's your legal team, your IT team, your marketing, your product teams. All of these individuals need to be on a committee that basically help to prioritize the organization's focus around data governance. As you can tell, there are many functions that may be implemented, but it's important that this particular team is able to set the strategy and also the focus for the organization. And then tactically, you need those individual subject areas, maybe the guy that's head of marketing or the person that's head of finance within your organization, to be able to be managers over their data because they understand the data at an intimate level and ultimately own it. And these individuals are what we call the tactical accountability managers. They're the ones that ultimately are responsible for the data. They own the data. And so below these individuals, you have the operational stewards. And these are the people that use the data every day. They're the ones that write the reports. They understand what the data means. They understand how it should be used. They understand the technology that's going to be used to process that data. They're also the individuals that may implement the technology, right, and administer it, your custodians. And then we also have your developers and analysts within the DG space that are helping you to put this whole project together and to make sure that your data governance functions are being implemented, whether it's a technology or your business analysts that are going and speaking with your policy folks, or it's your folks working on data quality within your organization, whatever it is, or data protection, or putting together your data subject rights solution. Whatever it is, these individuals need to have top level support because the data that they're working with 99% of the time is not just focused on the specific domain or particular group they may be working in, but it's going to ultimately affect the entire enterprise. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about a quick approach. We won't have a lot of time to deep dive into the approach, but if we go to the next slide, it's like a 4-step approach that we have to implement or get started with this iterative process. As I said before, don't boil the ocean. You can't get it all done at once. You have to start small, pick the critical data, show value, and grow your functions within your organization. And eventually you get there. And so, of course, assessment, we talked about that, making sure you discover and understand where the data is. Identify the policy gaps. And I always talk about the policy gaps simply because the policies drive the things you're going to do. How are you going to do them? When are you going to do them? Under what circumstances? And if you start implementing the technology many times without having clear guidance and standards from your policies, it's going to be very difficult because more than likely when those policies get written or your legal team or compliance team looks at it, they're probably going to require you to make changes and it's going to cause rework. So you want to avoid that. Then you want to make sure that you also do a risk assessment, especially as it pertains to your data protection, making sure that you understand where the risk is within the organization in terms of your, we call it, there's a DPIA or data privacy impact assessment that basically gives you the ability to look at your organization and understand a list of questions that you may ask to figure out what systems you have, what data is in those systems, how is that data being used, what environments that data is spread across, and understanding that helps you, of course, to develop your strategy around many of the things you need to do. You start establishing your policies, building your requirements, and of course, you define your organization's data. Are we going to organize our data by domains? Are we going to organize them by subject areas? Are we going to organize them by departments? What and how are we going to do that? And of course, before you get started with doing the work that's going to require other teams and other groups to be able to be involved, start that education and that marketing campaign around your data governance initiative. Because if you have that executive support, doing that becomes very easy to basically get everybody on the same page. And of course, identifying your stewards. Then the work begins. If you go back one slide for a moment, the work really begins around this step 3. And step 3 basically focuses on getting the work implemented. So that's your solutions, implementing the different architecture changes, and then continuing that process for your future data governance journey is, even though you may go through this entire process for individual functions or multiple functions, ultimately, when you get to the end, you're going to continue to improve it and make it better. Now, what we're going to do really quickly is we're going to jump in and talk about two of the main areas. It's the entry point that most organizations start their data governance journey. And we're going to talk about data quality and data cataloging. And right now, I'm going to turn it over to 𝐂𝐡𝐚, and he's going to share a few experiences and information with you about how you potentially could get started on your data governance journey. I think you're muted, so we can't hear you yet.
Hello. Hello.
We can hear you now.
Oh, great. Yes. So thank you. Thanks a lot, Charles. So can we move to the next slide? Yes. So getting into the details of, say, how to implement your data governance strategy. So I believe it all starts from, say, identifying your tool of choice to carry out your data governance activities, which Charles will take you through in the upcoming slides. And so once you have your tool of choice, so you identify your data sources of choice, and you connect them to the tool, and you ingest your metadata information to the tool, and you analyze your metadata, you understand your data thoroughly, so you are able to carry out the necessary steps on it. And once you connect your data to the tool, so the next step you would want to carry out is set up policies or policy frameworks. So essentially, in this context, policy framework means deciding who can access this data, what kind of description should we capture for this data, and how often should this data be used, and so on. So you set up such policy frameworks, and then you carry out necessary data quality checks to ensure how good your data is looking like, how reliable your data is, and so on. And once you have this understanding, then you go about setting up data stewardship processes, so which essentially contain, say, describing your tables, say what kind of information do each of these tables have, and what are the key columns for these tables that I should be particular about. And also, can I provide ratings to my table? So ratings essentially depend on the quality of the data in the table, how often is this table being used, what is the underlying source for this table, and how reliable is the source, and so on. So now that we understand what are our key tables and what kind of information those tables capture, and so on, we can go a step further and try and understand the attributes or the individual columns in these tables. So you can go ahead and create data dictionaries for your tables, and also you can say every organization has a set of key KPIs that they rely on, has a set of key reports that they use often across different teams. So it is also important, like Charles mentioned earlier, it is also important that we set up a standard definition for our KPIs, and we ensure that those KPIs are being used consistently across. The definitions align across different solutions or different reports. So also, if they are not aligning across different reports, we have to understand why. There are times when they don't, so we have to be aware of such instances. And also, once it is important to always work with your data SMEs or data owners to align on whatever definitions you believe the data or the KPI should consist. And now that we understand our data well, it also makes sense to create STMs for your data, or creating data pipelines to. So this will help you understand how your data starts from your source, and how it migrates to the consumption layer, or what sort of transitions it takes throughout the process. So moving on. So getting into the data quality framework. So while in the previous slide we tried to understand how to handle metadata. So in this slide, let's try and understand how to ensure the quality of the data. So it all starts. The first step to understanding the quality of the data is understanding the existing issues in the data. So to understand that, a lot of tools offer you a process called profiling, data profiling. It essentially is the tool's way of, say, picking a column from a table of your choice, going skimming through the entire data in the column, trying to understand the pattern that the data is following in the column, and identifying like instances where the data is say deviating from majority of the behavior, or the data is following a pattern that is against what is expected of the day of the column, and so on. So it tries to identify discrepancies in your data, and then it calls them out. So you can go through the discrepancies and try and understand what could the potential reason be. How do we fix this, or is this actually an acceptable behavior? If that is the case, then sure, the data is looking fine. Just to give you an example, say the column phone number in your data should essentially contain phone number, just numbers. And ideally the length of the string should be 10 digits. What if you have certain values that go to a 15 digit, or what if you have certain values that are text? So you will want to, like, your tool will identify such instances where your data is going beyond the normal, and you can like then deep dive into your data and take a call. So once you carry this exercise out initially, then you identify the issues. You collate all of these issues over time into a repository where where you will have a list of all the things that can essentially go wrong with the data. And then based on these issues, you create rules, like the in the example I mentioned earlier. So a phone number column, the phone number should essentially have 10 digits only, and it should only contain numbers. These are rules that you can create in this repository. And then you can run this process called profiling on your data set intermittently, once in a while, whenever you want to like understand your data is looking accurate. And then this tool captures data discrepancies, and it calls out. So you can take immediate action, and not wait till some data engineer or somebody points out an issue in the data where we have to go back and debug. uh, and so the next step to this is, so once we carry out, say, our profiling exercise, how do we consume the results? So there is a solution called scorecards, essentially, or a data quality dashboard, where where you can actually push all of the findings from your profiling in, and you can have your data steward or your SME, whoever is supposedly owner of that data, monitor it at regular intervals to identify if a data issue exists. So moving on to the next slide. So essentially, data quality is measured based on 6 attributes or 6 metrics. So the first metric is completeness, which essentially means how sparse is my data? Do I have the data I need, and do I have a lot of missing values in the data? And 2, validity, the example of phone number that I gave you earlier, or say a column called city can only have text values. It cannot have values. It cannot have special characters. It cannot have numbers. So what is the data following the pattern it is supposed to? And then accuracy. So how accurate is the underlying data source? Do we trust the underlying data source? And consistent, say the same data point can exist across multiple sources or multiple systems. So if that is the case, we want to make sure the all of these data sources or systems are actually speaking the same truth. If they are not, there can be cases where they are not. Then we need to understand why and establish that it is acceptable that they are speaking different things. And the next thing you would want to look into is integrity. So I mean, you sometimes you have your underlying, say you have an underlying attribute on top of which you have multiple columns built for different use cases. So the relationship established between this underlying attribute and columns, that has to be consistent and accurately defined. And then you have timeliness. So timeliness helps to ensure you're using the latest data and not stale data. So how often is my data refreshing? What is how latest is the data I'm using? And so on. So these are some of the things that these are some of the metrics that you would want to look into while assessing the quality of your data. And now that we understand our metadata well, and we set up a whole process for metadata, and we set up a whole process to understand your data quality, it makes sense to combine all of these pieces and create one large automated solution where you have your dashboard assess the quality of your data. And so when you see that there is some issue with the data, you're able to go back and understand it from a metadata level and connect the entire story together. So now Charles will take you through more details on how to implement data governance strategy.
Thank you so much for that, 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿. So 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿 just touched on two of the main areas that organizations generally start. And so we're going to talk really quickly about some accelerators. And so these accelerators are basically things that help you to get started with your data governance journey. So if you go to the next slide, ultimately, what we have are tools that will basically help you on multiple of those functions. So those boxes that we talked about earlier with each of those different functions of data governance within them, ultimately, there are solutions out there like, Collibra and 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿 and Informatica that have tools that help you to do cataloging, right? And so these tools will help you to accelerate how quickly you do it. So you're not going to be starting with a spreadsheet and trying to figure it out all out on your own. But these tools are accelerators. I want to point out a couple of these. In addition to that, organizations also sometimes have, existing product suites within their organization that are that have other solutions that work together. Like Informatica and IBM are two great examples of that. Because if you have ParCenter, for example, within your organization, it might, and their data privacy management tool, Secure Source, the old name of it. But if you have those tools in your house, it may make sense to get Axon because then it brings it together, right? So figuring out where and what your organization is going to use and the tools you're going to use to accelerate it is going to be specific to your organization. But I encourage organizations to look at the different tools that are on the market and compare them, right? And identify them. And if you need help with that, that's something that we've done quite extensive work on to be able to help organizations to fast track the tool selection. And of course, things like Monte Carlo that help you to do a data observability, right? So we'll not talk too much about this, but we'll go to the final slide. And, as you think about how you may get started or where you are in your data governance journey, right? How close are you to the mountaintop? I want to just point out some of the main things I was highlighting as we went through the presentation about DG and data governance and why it fails, right? So executive sponsorship, as I mentioned to you before, is paramount. And it's one of the main reasons that organizations don't move forward with their data governance initiatives, simply because it started in one department and they realize that they have to get the entire organization data together in order to implement it. And if you don't do that, the project moves very slow, or you lose steam, and adoption becomes very difficult, trying to get other groups to get on board if it's not coming from the top. Tool implementation is not data governance. So getting a data governance cataloging tool that may say it's a data governance tool is not data governance. Remember, data governance is data, people, processes, and policies. And then finally, data governance is a part of your organization's culture. You have to make it a part of your culture. It's not this project that you start and then you get to a point and it ends. It's something that is a part of your organization's culture and a part of all the processes that you put in place, so that every time something is happening or in your organization, you're thinking about how it's going to be a part of that data governance framework. And don't boil the ocean. It's all right. You can't do it all at once, right? You don't get to the top of the mountain the day you start climbing. Pick something that's critical, add value, start there, and then move from there. And then, as I mentioned before, one size doesn't fit all. So it's really important to figure out and make the assessment. Do the assessment. Take the time. You may want to get started because you know what the problem is. You know we have a data quality problem in our organization. But take the time to do the assessment. Discover where the issues are. Isolate it. Fix the main problems within that specific function before you start going out and trying to do multiple things all at once, because it'll become overwhelming for your organization and also for the individuals involved. We don't have much time, but I'm going to take time to answer one of the questions that was submitted. And it was, while getting started on the data governance journey, what strategies do you suggest in identifying a pilot project so that the whole data governance program is set up for success? And I think what I just said is one of the main areas that you want to start. You want to make sure you do an assessment. You want to make sure that assessment looks at your organization's data, how it's spread, and understand where the pain points are. Because where the pain points are that are affecting either the bottom line or making it your organization operate inefficiently because of the data, whether it's the reports or the inaccuracies in the data that's being delivered, or the timeliness of how that data is being delivered, or not being able to understand it, you're going to get from a survey basically answers from the users of the data so that you can start pinpointing where to start. Once you know that, the next thing is to basically take that and go on a campaign with your management team to explain to them the impact of those data challenges that you have, and explain to them how data governance is going to be able to help you on that journey. So start with the assessment, figure out the main pain points, and once you've figured out the main points, then go from there. I think I have time for one more question, and it's, given the iterative and long-term nature of running a data governance program, how do we ensure that we quantify the benefits of the program on a consistent basis? That was an excellent question. Now, we talked about auditing and reporting earlier on, and it's at the foundational level, right? When you want to be able to show the progress as you're growing, right? The child growth, or like use the mountain again. You're at the bottom of the mountain, you're checking the altitude all the time. How high am I? How close am I to the top, right? And so as a part of your data governance function, when you're implementing it, each of those functions, you should have clearly defined metrics that are going to determine what success looks like. I'll give you an example for data quality, for example. Let's just say your organization has 10 systems where your data is spread across, but 2 of those systems are where you have most of the data. And within those 2 systems, there are specific data that is within that system that causes problem for the organization. You can then start creating metrics to show, okay, this represents a percentage of all the data that we need to cover within our organization. And you can start saying, okay, we have now implemented the rules around this data set, or we may have implemented the ability for us to be able to monitor this long term, using those metrics and reports. So that's one way of being able to quantify your progress so that your management can see how you're doing. We're all out of time, unfortunately, but we encourage you to reach out to us, contact us at marketing@facspan.com. I hope this was informative for you today. I know we ran out of time because went a little bit over, but I hope this information was helpful. Feel free to reach out to us, and we will, do our best to help you on your data governance. Parul, over to you.
Thank you. We're out of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I figured